Hello everyone, welcome back to the Zach F1 channel, and in today's video we're going to be going over everything you will need to know going into Japan for the F1 Fantasy. So first up, I'll show you how well my team did last weekend. 239 points, pretty good. Leclerc could have done a bit better by having Sainz, who would have been the best option. However, I was a little bit on the fence about Sainz, considering he just came back from surgery. Stroll, very good to keep him in. Sonoda, I knew he was going to have a good race eventually, and it happened this weekend. And the rest of my team did good as well. And then with this result, this puts me now almost into the top 9,000 in the global leagues. Again, considering I've used no chips, this is the perfect start to the season, and it means I can play around with my team quite a lot going into Japan. And then just before we start the video, make sure to like and subscribe. Follow my Twitter for more news on F1 Fantasy, and remember that I will be going live before the qualifying and after the race to go over all of the F1 Fantasy talk, because the practice results will matter on the teams we select. Now, the first thing we need to talk about going into this weekend is that F1 Fantasy tools have cracked the code for how the value changes work. I'll put up a link to their Twitter down below. Have a look for yourself. It's very detailed and it's very well put together, and it really helps all of us F1 Fantasy players out there to sort of figure out what's going to be going on with the value changes. Thank you very much, F1 Fantasy tools. Now, going on to the actual F1 Fantasy news. First off, let's talk about the big three: Leclerc versus Sainz versus Perez. Now, a lot of people will be saying that Perez is a no-go after that Australian weekend. We need to be careful when we say that, because yes, he's the most expensive, and Sainz and Leclerc do look good in that Ferrari. However, not only are Ferrari bringing upgrades to Japan, but Red Bull is as well. And when you remember that Perez got a free-place grid penalty starting in 6th, if Perez started in 3rd, it could have been a very different story, and he could have been the one who did better over Leclerc and Sainz quite easily. And bar Australia, Perez has been a pretty consistent driver for us so far. However, with that said, I don't think he's the best option going forward. Now, I'll talk about Sainz, who I think was the biggest shock of the weekend. Obviously, just coming back from his surgery. We know Sainz is a good driver. However, did we expect him to win? No, not at all. We thought Verstappen would win. However, his car obviously stopped working, and it really left Sainz open to take the win, and he kept Leclerc at bay. He's cheaper than Leclerc, he's cheaper than Perez, and I do think if you're going for a certain type of team that I'll talk about later, Sainz is definitely the right move. However, if you want to switch over to Verstappen, I believe that Leclerc is the person you still want to keep with, as he looks like the middle ground between Perez and Sainz, and if Ferrari do look good, you can always count on Leclerc to be right there. Now, going forward, talking about McLaren, do we still not want to bring in McLaren? The answer is yes, you still don't want to bring in McLaren. The reason for this is because they're still just too expensive, and even though they had a very good weekend in Australia, Red Bull will be scoring more points than them in Japan, most likely. Mercedes potentially will be a bit better also, plus Aston Martin are still thereabouts. However, it just really comes to the point where now we know what the best teams are to get. It's a real issue, because if you want McLaren, you would probably have to either take out Red Bull or Ferrari. Now, if you took out Red Bull and did Ferrari and McLaren, obviously Red Bull will probably get you more points than McLaren. However, you could bring in Verstappen. However, that's not the case anymore, and that's the issue. People can bring in Verstappen with Red Bull Ferrari, so it doesn't really make sense when Ferrari are the much better option and Red Bull are the much better option over McLaren. And then the same thing if you get rid of Ferrari for McLaren, you could either bring in Sainz or Leclerc as your top driver. However, there's not really much of a point when we know that McLaren won't score any more points than Ferrari. So still for now, McLaren is a no-go. Then moving on to some drivers. Who is the best driver to have under 6 million? We only have 2 at the minute, and that is Valtteri Bottas and Logan Sargeant. And for me, the best driver out there for this price is definitely Logan Sargeant, purely because, yes, Logan Sargeant at Suzuka was not a good mix last season. He actually crashed twice. Once, funnily enough, also into Bottas, spinning him. So he is a bit more risky. However, Sargeant seems to be getting more points than Bottas this season, and you really want to stay clear away from the kick salvos at the minute, considering their pit stop times and they just can't get it right. it's a bit scary having Bottas, especially as well, considering he normally comes around 15th, 16th, 17th, and he normally doesn't move from there, not getting any points, and he's just been dropping further down in the price values. So for me, it's Logan Sargent over Bottas. Now, for the low-costing mid-drivers, which is Zhou, Albon, Hulkenberg and Gasly. We'll start off with Zhou. Zhou suffers with the same issue as Bottas, where Kicks Albert are just so bad with their pit stops. Even if Zhou was having a good weekend, it just probably ruined the whole weekend for him. But he is the definition of what we want in F1 Fantasy. Bad in qualifying, good in races. That's the only saving grace. However, Kicks Albert, it's just a bit scary at the minute, and I'd be cautious if you pick them unless it's the only option you actually physically can have. And then we talk about Nico Hulkenberg at 7.2 million. I've actually warmed up to him a bit now because I used to firmly believe he did a lot better in qualifying and then sort of falls back in the races, which used to be the case. However, in Jeddah, obviously that didn't happen. And then in Australia as well, that didn't happen as well. So Hulkenberg slowly becoming an option. That is not a bad shout at all. And considering he's only 7.2 million and he's been scoring around 10 points the last 2 weekends, keep an eye on Hulkenberg. I expect to see him in quite a few teams this weekend. And then you have the likes of Alex Albon. Now for me, I think Alex Albon is moving onto the no-go list purely because he's just getting too good at qualifying, coming 12th or 13th, but then he either drops off in the race or stays around there, sort of like Bottas. And that's the issue, because we need to get overtake points if you're not doing well in the races top 10 wise. And if you come 11th, you're actually the first loser, basically. However, if you stay lower end of the top 10 or even get pushed back, which we've seen with Albon, you just don't get that many points. So for me, I wouldn't get Albon unless you need to. And then the final driver in this low-costing mid area would be Pierre Gasly. And for me, he still is the best option out of the bunch. 7.4 million, bad at qualifying. We obviously see the Alpines mostly 20th and 19th. And you just got to hope that the car doesn't break down or that they don't have any issues with any other drivers. And it'll get you a consistent 4 to 7 points, which we've seen with Ocon and we've seen with Gasly that it can happen. That's why I love Gasly. The Alpines seem like drivers you can predict their points on the most, which I quite like in F1 Fantasy. It's that little bit of safety. So for me, ranking wise on those drivers, it would be Gasly, Hulkenberg, Albon, and then Zhou, best to worst. Now the best mid-price drivers, and that consists of Magnussen, Tsunoda, Ocon and Ricciardo. We'll start off with Magnussen. Magnussen is probably the best one out of the bunch. At 7.7 million, he has been phenomenal this season, helping Haas to get points, helping Haas to get a double points finish, first time for quite a while. And again, he is the golden boy of cheap drivers for F1 Fantasy at the minute. Doing bad in qualifying and doing good in races. That's all we need these cheap drivers to do and keep on doing to get around that 6 to like 12 points area that gives them driver value and keeps us going, trying to get better teams. Then you have Yuki Tsunoda, who again is really good at qualifying, and that was the issue with the last few of his races. However, we've seen in Australia and Jeddah, when he actually reaches into the top 10, it didn't happen in Jeddah because he got unlucky with the Hasses last time. But in the Australian Grand Prix, we saw if he just sticks around the lower end of the top 10, 11th, 12th, and gets a good qualifying, he will get you points. He will get you overtakes. And that's all he needed. He just needed a race where he wasn't unlucky, and that is why Yuki Tsunoda is a good option, even though he qualifies well, which sort of contradicts what I've been saying. Then we have Esteban Ocon, which is very similar to Gasly, however just a bit more expensive, and that's why I don't rate him as much, because yes, Gasly has less points. However, I feel like that's just because he's been more unlucky. And I feel like if you're going for Ocon or Gasly, you could literally just save money by going for Gasly instead. And then finally, we have Ricciardo, who is the most expensive of the bunch, and that's the issue. If you get Ricciardo in, he's the most expensive. You probably won't be able to bring in Stroll, who I think is a better option than Ricciardo. And just for what he offers, you can easily drop down to his teammate, save a lot of money. You could drop down to Magnussen as well. And it just saves you loads of money, and they will probably score you more points than Ricciardo. So rankings wise, I would put Magnussen the best, Tsunoda, Ocon, and then Ricciardo. And then a driver I briefly mentioned was Lance Stroll. Now, should you keep him for Japan? Now, last season, he did not finish the race, which is a bit scary. However, I think it's worth the risk at the minute. If you're not having Verstappen in your team, which I'll get onto in a second, then keep the Stroll with Leclerc, Sainz, or Perez, because I think at the minute, if you go to Alonso, you have to bring in Sargent or Bottas, and I actually think Stroll for now can keep up close enough to Alonso to where having that Magnussen instead of a Sargent or a Bottas will actually do you better in the long run, plus points wise. And then I'll quickly talk about the constructors, where nothing's changed for me, with Red Bull and Ferrari being the most dominant, and you really need them in your team. Again, I can't stress enough, do not go for any of the following: Sauber, Haas, VCarb, Alpine or Williams. They do not give you enough points for F1 Fantasy. And again, I say this in every video, but constructors are key in F1 Fantasy. Also, stay clear of Mercedes and McLaren. Sort of for similar points, they don't get you enough points, but that's because they don't get you enough points for how expensive they are. Considering Red Bull actually is only 5 million more than McLaren, and they get you a lot more points on a normal weekend. And Ferrari get you a shit ton more points than Mercedes would give you. But then I'd quickly like to mention Aston Martin. Now, I wouldn't actually recommend having Aston Martin for now, because your trump card of Verstappen in the Red Bull Aston Martin team isn't really a trump card anymore, because other people can get it for other teams. However, it's still not a bad option. So if you do want a constructor that is cheap, Aston Martin would be the one to go for. Finally, if I did not talk about any driver in this area of the video, that means they are not worth looking at and you should not have them in your team. So let's finally get on to the team selections for Japan. Now we'll start off with the wildcard team selections, because in Japan, if you have over 104.6 million in your team value, you can afford a Verstappen, Red Bull, Ferrari team, or another team I'll talk about in a second. However, this is the team one. Now for me, I'll be waiting until practice to lock this in. However, if Red Bull still look dominant, I'll be putting this team in with Verstappen, Sargent, Zhou, Hulkenberg, Albon, Red Bull, Ferrari. Now this is because I can afford it. Because I can afford it at 105.9 million. However, I'm not too happy having Zhou, and I'm not too happy about having Sargent. However, Verstappen will very much make up for it, especially because of him dropping so much last weekend. If something bad does happen to your team this weekend, you could lose out on the possibility of getting Verstappen in for the sprint weekend in China. You really need to have Verstappen or the wildcard 2 team by China. Now, if you only have 104.6 million, you could use this team. Is Verstappen, Bottas, Sargent, Zhou and Hulkenberg, which is basically all of the lowest costing drivers with Verstappen. And I full-heartedly believe that these teams are better than any teams out there at the minute. You can stick to the Leclerc teams that we were using before. However, Verstappen just holds that consistency. Yes, he didn't finish the race in Australia. However, that was the first time in like 2 years. So having Verstappen plus Red Bull and Ferrari in the team, it sounds like a cheat code, and it basically is a cheat code. But with these teams, the main priority is trying to get rid of Bottas. If you bring in this wildcard team, hope to increase your driver value to get rid of Bottas, mainly because of what I've said about Kick Sauber. And that is about all you need for this team, and you should do very good. Now, the wildcard 2, I'm a bit more on the fence about. However, it is the wildcard I would agree on if you want to use extra DRS going into the Chinese Grand Prix. I would recommend waiting later on in the season when you've got more money to play around with, potentially 2 better drivers than this. However, the wildcard is Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso, Hulkenberg, Magnussen, Sargent, Red Bull and Ferrari. Again, you can lower the cheap drivers of Hulkenberg, Magnussen if you don't have enough money. If you have more money, you can improve Sargent to a Zhou. However, this would do well for you in extra DRS, because you've got to remember 3 times would go to Sainz and 2 times would go to Alonso, which I think actually would be better than a 3 times with Verstappen and a 2 times on Albon or Hulkenberg. So if you do want to use a 3 time, I would recommend wildcarding to get into this team, or if you have enough transfers, you can try to push for that team in the first place as well and not have to wildcard. But yeah, for me, only use this team if Ferrari look better than Red Bull going into Suzuka. Now, back to the normal teams. Of course, I've spoken about the Sainz team, so I won't talk about that much. So I won't talk about that. However, we've got the Leclerc team, very similar to last weekend's team, with Leclerc, Stroll, Magnussen, Tsunoda, Gasly, Red Bull, and Ferrari. The only person I changed for this team is replacing Albon with Gasly, as I think that is a better option going forward. This team is still good, and if you don't want to use your wild card, I'd recommend using it. And same goes for the Perez team, which is basically you just switch out Leclerc for Perez and then drop Tsunoda down to a Hulkenberg to make money for it. However, just be careful with these two teams, of course, because now people have Verstappen, Red Bull, Ferrari, or Sainz and Alonso. These teams are in a bit of danger, and I'd only use these teams if you don't have enough money to move to the wildcard teams I was talking about. Now, for the alternate teams that don't have Red Bull and Ferrari, I would not recommend having any combination of Red Bull and VCarb or any of the constructors I mentioned earlier, purely because it's just not good enough at this point. Your trump card of Verstappen is gone, so a Red Bull Aston Martin versus Red Bull Ferrari, Red Bull Ferrari are going to be the better option, and you're going to lose out 20-30 points each race weekend. So you just have to be careful. However, if you can't afford the Red Bull Ferrari Verstappen team, this is still not a bad shout. You've just got to hope for a few price value changes, and then you're closer to your goal. However, I would recommend doing that with Red Bull Ferrari, because Ferrari are moving up more than Aston Martin, and Perez, Leclerc and Sainz are moving up more in value as well, rather than Verstappen. So it would probably take you longer to get to the Red Bull Ferrari team if you had the Red Bull Aston Martin team. But again, like I mentioned, still a decent team to have. Every other team at this point, though, probably is not good enough for now. Now, that is all the teams out of the way. Let's talk about the chips we should use for Suzuka. So for me, I will be using the wild card most likely. That's because I can't transfer in the Verstappen Red Bull Ferrari team without using at least 3 transfers. And then even if I did, I would have to use 4 transfers to get to the team that I like. And I don't want to take a -20, and I feel like this is the best time to wild card. However, I would like to add that yes, it means if McLaren do start to get better with their upgrades, I won't have the wild card for that. However, Verstappen will probably still be better than McLaren's, and all I would need to do to get to that team is replace Ferrari and McLaren. However, if you can't afford Verstappen or the Sainz and Alonso team this weekend, do not use the wildcard and wait a little bit. Again, for no negative, we tend to get a few crashes around Suzuka, so it wouldn't be a bad option to use no negative. However, if you're following me, I will be using no negative in China next weekend, so I wouldn't recommend fully going for the no negative in Suzuka. However, the other chip, your limitless, your autopilots, your final fix, and more, I would not recommend using going into this weekend. Again, just because it's not a sprint race weekend and you have to be using these chips on sprint race weekends. However, that is all the info you will need for Japan. Let's go ahead and look at my league. Thank you all so much for joining it. I'll give the lead code down below in the comments and in the description. Please join. I believe we have around 450 people in my league now, so thank you all so much for joining it, and we have some good competition at the top and everywhere in the league, so thank you all so much for joining it. I really appreciate the support. Here are the top 5 in my league. It's a shout out to all of you. Congratulations. I hope you keep on doing well. But from me, that is all I have to say for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all for another F1 video later this week. Bye-bye.